Hello?
Hello. We are live.
You just caught us in the middle of a fascinating physics conversation.
Yes.
Which may become pertinent at some point during the conversation.
Yeah.
It feels like it's got to go there now.
Yeah, I got all excited because I was like, ooh, Alex is reading quantum physics. I'm so excited. I totally love that stuff.
Oh, man. So we are welcome to the Red Couch Theology podcast with our ugly, uncomfortable red couch, which brands a deep and valuable theological conversation each week.
Yes.
So welcome.
Welcome.
We've been talking in our community at South through this book Jeremiah, prophet from the Old Testament, and this was our last week. We're in Holy Week.
Yeah.
We are moving from Lent to Resurrection, which is just exciting. I
love that you're doing the intro this time. Feels great.
I don't even know why I'm doing the intro. It felt like if I let you do the intro, we'd be talking about physics.
Straight to quantum physics.
So I was actually just chatting to some people. Someone was talking to me about the faith journey they're on, and I was like, "That's really exciting." I said, "We should get you up to preach on Sunday sometime." I was like, "Not this week, obviously. It's Easter Sunday," and I was just like joking with them how when I was a youth pastor and an associate pastor, I would always be like, "Why doesn't the lead pastor ever let me preach on Easter Sunday? Like Resurrection Sunday, I want to do that one." And then I got to be a lead pastor, and I was like, "Oh, that's why, because it's so much fun, and you only get to do it once a year, and it's so hard to give up."
That's fun.
Like it's just so joyful. This like highest and best day of the year. I don't know, man. What a joy to be in this week.
Yes, it's exciting. So we have some fun stuff for our community and for those who attend here. We're anticipating a joyful celebration, which brings us without any good segue to, have you ever bought a field at Anathoth?
When I buy fields, I only buy fields at Anathoth.
Yeah. When was the last time you bought a field?
So I have not bought a field.
Okay, fair enough.
My aunt was a farmer. She passed away. She owns a farm in Sussex. So I'm well versed in the art of buying and selling fields.
Yeah. And the only reason you haven't is none in Anathoth have come up for sale.
I'm actually not even sure where Anathoth is, which says something about
probably in the Middle East
about,
somewhere.
Well, yeah, that's probably fair. Unless Jeremiah did some real traveling, although there are people in Ireland that are convinced that Jeremiah is buried in Ireland.
Really?
Yeah, I have a guy that I went out with to do some mission work with, and he took me on this drive, and he said, "Yeah, this is where Jeremiah is buried."
What?
And he's got this whole story about how he moved from like Israel to Egypt because that's where they flee to, and then like there was this migration of people, and so like that's so the Irish and English competition there is that so that's the Irish belief. Jeremiah came here and died here, and he's buried. So the English, always willing to one up the Irish wherever possible, came up with this story where Jesus came to England. So there's this whole hymn Jerusalem, which is like a really well-known hymn. It's sung regularly.
This is like an urban legend episode of the Red Couch Theology podcast.
Yeah, potentially, yeah. But it's fascinating because this is how you like if you think about how nations buy or create some level of divine right or divine nature to them. Like these are the kinds of things that you do.
Totally.
So the story goes, it's in this hymn, Jerusalem. There's one verse that says, "And did those feet in ancient times walk over England's green and pleasant lands?" And the background story to that is that Joseph of Arimathea could easily have been Jesus' uncle, just based on how narratives work and stuff. There seems like there might be some deeper connection or some family connection. He was probably a trader. Trade routes during that period probably went through Britain, and so Jesus might have gone on a trade adventure with him when he was a teenager, and all of that led them to say, yeah, definitely came here, definitely walked these lands, and therefore as a country we have some kind of divine endorsement that other countries don't have. But interestingly, like probably similar language in different ways about any country that has some of that behind it. I've had people since I moved over here say to me, "Isn't it interesting the US is the only country in the world that was founded on Christianity. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Is that true? So
yeah, that's a struggle to make that debate from church history.
But some people, would make that argument. So it just becomes like interesting how nations will find stories that support some of their privilege, I guess.
Their national identity. Yeah.
Anyway, Jeremiah. At this
that was
point,
for free.
Yeah, it was for free.
Yeah, that was great.
Jeremiah.
Yeah, give us some background on Jeremiah and where you went this last week, and then you want to talk about stories in general.
Well, this is intriguing to me. So Jeremiah, prophetic book, 25 odd chapters, coming disaster and moment of disaster. But then the question becomes, what happens? What do you do when the disasters hit? Like, what's the turn in the conversation? So Jeremiah, after bringing like fire and judgment, and we've done this practice if you're not part of South, where during Lent, we've had people read stand for the reading of the text, and we've responded with, this is the word of God for the people of God and for the world.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. And some weeks, that's been really hard to say that to.
Yeah,
It's been like, because he's predicting absolute disaster. So how do you say that when he's like, yep, the king of Babylon's going to come and he's going to shut up this city and he's going to knock everything down and he's going to kill everyone that gets in his way? How do you read those and say, this is the word of God for the people of God? Thanks be to God. Now then you've got to the point where the story has got as bad as everything Jeremiah predicted. Like, everything started to come true. The city is surrounded by armies. People are being killed. People are starving. There is the imminence, at least, of defeat, if not actual defeat yet. And then he gets all optimistic. He starts talking about how everything's going to fix it. God's going to fix everything. Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you a hope and a future. What hope? The city's about to be destroyed. Jeremiah 31.
I think he's just upbeat because he's like, he knows he was right. He's like, aha! I win.
Yeah.
I'm all excited.
Petty.
Just not because the city's being torn down, but because I told you so.
Yeah. I was retributively right, to the best kind of right.
Oh man,
it's like, I won this argument. Everyone else said it was great, and I said it was wrong, and it's bad.
Remember all those guys who said peace? I win.
No peace. The only peace is going to be when everyone's dead. Now he's like, he's Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you. Jeremiah 31. He starts talking new covenant. God is going to do something new. He's going to change your hearts amongst you. Chapter 33.
Yeah.
I'm going to create a branch out of David, and there's going to be a new king who's going to rule, and all of that should be an impossibility. It should be an end to the story, and it's not an end to the story. And I guess there's two elements to that, I think. One is that, well, is that just our human nature? We have to look for a new possibility. We have to look for new stories, or is it just that, well, this is God's new story? But it seems like this has been the case over and over again with the people of Israel. It seems like all through the Old Testament, the story looks like it's over. And then it's almost like God can't resist the beauty of a new story emerging from the old one. I don't know, I just find that fascinating.
Yeah, so like, what do we do with that then, specifically with Jeremiah? What I hear you saying is, okay, yay, everything did turn out okay-ish in the end, aside from the people who suffered and all that stuff. But Jeremiah is a happy ending.
Yeah.
Yay. The end.
Yeah.
So then, what do we do as we read this years later? How do we wrestle with, okay, it doesn't feel like that for us now. Does it always end with a happy ending? All those kinds of questions.
Well, I think that, but is that maybe not why we don't like, we struggle with this kind of literature? I mean, that's why at least we want to take bits of it out. Like the only real connection I've had to Jeremiah is a text. For years as a pastor, he's talking through Jeremiah 29:11. Or maybe even something as abstract as when God says to Jeremiah at the start, don't let people look down on you because you're young. So I'll say to a bunch of teenagers, hey, this is the message of Jeremiah. Like, don't let people look down on you. You might be young, but you've still got a value. Grasping the context of the whole book, and then where the story goes now, is always really hard for us, I think.
So, all right, I have a question. So you are self-admittedly, and joke about it all the time on this podcast, that you're naturally wired to be upbeat. You're extroverted. You're sort of a jolly character.
Jolly character. I just need I just need a belly and a bowl full of jelly.
And then and a big white beard, and you'll be Santa Claus reincarnate. Yeah. Anyway, my experience on sort of being a little bit more on the receiving end. Obviously, I'm participating more in some of the content and services than the average attender of South Fellowship Church, but I've still been on the receiving end of the messages. That this series has been kind of a good, beautiful thing for our community. There seems to be some resonance there. And here's the question. Is some of the heaviness that you've had to navigate our community through in this teaching time, is that heaviness almost a prerequisite to the ultimate joy of experiencing it as a community, and then the release of hope at the end of the story? Like, if you just made it jolly throughout the entire thing, would it have been the same? If Jeremiah just was happy, hopeful all the time, would it actually have been a piece of literature that has power?
So I think there's lots of churches that don't want to talk about the parts where the story seems broken.
Yeah.
Like we acknowledge them, but we always we get straight to, oh yeah, one day all will be well, which is where we landed this week. I mean, the beautiful Julian of Norwich idea, all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. But we struggle to sit with some of the darker aspects. And so we've tried to do that, even with my weird upbeatness in doing that, which I think has been this weird tension every week.
Yeah.
How do I manage my personality alongside a text that's a little heavier? The beauty of doing that is that when people are in the worst moments, suddenly they've got texts that reflect their current situation. So I think you're right. Like, does Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday, does that always reflect how we feel? Probably not. It always reflects who we are. We're resurrection people, but it probably doesn't reflect how we feel at all. And so for a moment, at least, we're like living in, this is what it feels like to be God's people when the king of Babylon is surrounding the city and there's no outs. But we still need enough hope to keep us going. And that's what Jeremiah does in this worst of moments. He gives enough hope on a corporate level that says, now interestingly, like, our individual reading would struggle with that because Jeremiah's language is really, most of you here are going to die. Either through starvation or through, the army finally breaching the walls and killing people, or you're going to end up as refugees in Egypt or somewhere like that. I mean, there's not really a good narrative for most of the individuals there. His language is all corporate. One day your children's children, or the Babylonian exiles, their children's children will come back. And there's a hope for our community, our ethnic group, our people. Yeah. And that language,
that's extra hard for us. For Jeremiah's day, that was actually a little bit more hopeful than we might feel because we think so individualistically.
Yes, but do you think? But we've talked before on the podcast how that's like almost unique in history.
What do you mean?
Like that individualistic element.
Yes, totally.
I was reading this.
Totally.
I was watching this little bit of the show Game of Thrones the other day, and one of the characters, man, I'm blanking on his name now, but he's part of the Lannister family. He's like the patriarch of the Lannister family. And there's a whole bunch of people listening that are like, oh, it's this guy. Why didn't you just know it's this guy? But when he's first introduced, he's talking to his son. And he's like, I need you to be the man you can be, not tomorrow, not next year. I need you to be that person today. Because in the next few months, our family, like our future will be decided. And how a short time from now, I'll be in my grave and you'll be in your grave and your sister will be in her grave and her kids will be in their graves. And the only thing that survives is the family name and the family honor. That's what we're here for. That's the game we're playing. Like individually, he's like, yeah, I don't care. Like family-wise, though, no, I'm determined this is going to be successful. That's such a classic view of his, that's such a general principle across humanity, across history. Our overly individualistic, I'll forget the family so long as I'm happy. That's so rare across history. So this is actually better news for the people of Judea than we can possibly imagine.
Yeah, we might get a little hung up. Well, what about the people who died?
Yeah.
That is a problem. That is a challenge that can be addressed or whatever. But for this, the readers of this, Jeremiah's hopeful statements are more hopeful than we might read them.
And I can't remember, did we talk about this on the podcast last week, or was it just you and I talking off the air? But I was reading about the first missionaries in Japan. And they're I don't remember the response they got from the Japanese people was, well, we believe you, but it would be dishonoring to our ancestors for us to accept Jesus and go to a paradise that they can't go to. Like, we're so committed to corporateness and family that we're opting out of a heavenly future.
Put that in your evangelism pipe and smoke
it. I know,
it.
yeah,
Like,
totally.
I had a professor would always say stuff like that. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. That's a tricky one for as you're a missionary. We were like, they didn't teach me this in missions class.
No, but don't you know, like, it's about you, and did you accept Jesus as your savior? They're like, no, it's family. Everything's family.
Yeah.
So there's a good news to this, but it is right now broadly a terrible situation that's slightly colored positively by Jeremiah's prophetic future hope that he starts talking about. Totally. God has a plan.
So let me get back to this narrative arc thing, because it's just I just love story and arc, and I know you do too. So you made a statement several times throughout the series, especially in the first few weeks. I think you said it every week, most of the weeks during the series. You said this thing that you get out of Easter what you put into Lent. And that's a narrative statement to some extent. You're actually saying that the goodness, the beauty, the light, the hope of Easter will be strengthened, undergirded, and more powerful and palpable and beautiful to your soul if you allow yourself to go through the heavy and the dark of Lent, or the contemplation of Lent.
Yeah, and you're right, it's a story. I mean, the stories just by nature, like, we just don't watch movies where, like, guy walks into a bar, meets girl, they get married, they live happily ever after.
Yeah, that's like the worst movie ever.
Yeah, we like, there's always conflict.
Yeah. In order for story to happen, there has to be conflict.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like the hero's journey. It's like you have protagonist, and then you have an inciting incident that sets that protagonist onto a different trajectory, and then they have to, like, overcome sort of doubt or uncomfort or whatever. And they might have a guide along the way.
There's this comedian that does this with Tom Cruise movies. So he's like, every Tom Cruise movie, when you actually look at it, until he started doing some niche stuff as he got older.
Niche?
Yeah, niche. Is exactly the same. So he said, like, you know, first he's a racing car driver, Days of Thunder. He's a pretty good racing car driver. Then he has a crisis of confidence. Then he meets a girl who helps him become a better racing driver than he was before. Now he's an Air Force pilot. He's a pretty good Air Force pilot. Then he has a crisis of confidence. Then he meets a girl who helps him become a better Air Force pilot. And now he's a sports agent. He's a pretty good sports agent. Then he has a crisis of confidence. Then he meets a girl who helps him become a better sports agent. Now he's a cocktail waiter. He's a pretty good cocktail waiter until he has a crisis of confidence. Then he meets a girl who helps him become a better cocktail waiter than he was before. And every story is exactly the same. They all involve a crisis of confidence.
Tom Cruise, if you're watching this show, you should read scripts a little differently, because clearly you're only attracted to that script.
But then clearly he does start to do that, because he starts doing some of these things that, they start to push, but it pushes character. But that story arc, so it's necessary in movies because they're created stories for entertainment. But it seems true of most stories that captivate us. So if you think about if you think of sin as the inciting incident in the Bible, what does the Bible look like without it? It's like a pamphlet with Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelation 21 and 22, right? Like that's all it is. It's 4 pages.
Okay, all right. So let's try and transition. So we've been pretty abstract so far.
Yeah.
So how do we anchor this conversation about narrative and story arc and Jeremiah and the necessity for challenge and crisis and inciting incident, whatever? Who cares? Like, why is that relevant for us today? And then I think there's a lot of cool things we can observe about narrative and apply it to our lives today. But how do we help people connect to that right now so that we don't lose them? Are we losing you out there?
Hold on a second. Maybe they're here for the abstract. That's why I'm in most conversations.
I know. I'm just saying, like.
Yeah, I know. I totally get you. So I think what it does is it's important for us, as you kind of touched on, to be able to say it's okay for it's okay for things to go south for a while, to get messy for a while. And we're terrible at this, especially when it's not us but a loved one. So with our kids, like, if I'm honest, I don't want my kids to have anything interesting happen to them except good things.
Yeah.
And yet I am who I am because of some of the bad things that happened. Like, character was formed in those times. I experienced God in different ways.
Yes.
I came through stuff. I struggled with different things. I went through periods of rebellion. So I don't wish it on them. And yet, like, if my attitude is they should never have anything happen, then what kind of people does that even create? So
yeah,
I think there's something about, and Jeremiah even touches on this. Like, he says, right now, people make reference. I think this is in chapter 4 or chapter 5. He says, right now, people say, I wouldn't look it up because I'm not even that sure.
Okay.
That would be like, you'd really could end up looking for a while. But early on, he says, this is all going to happen. The bad stuff's coming. One day, people will no longer refer to God as the Lord who brought us out of Egypt, but they'll start referring to him as the Lord who brought us out of exile in Babylon. Like the story that you talk about somewhat abstractly, as we have, as a story from our history, a story from 1,000 years ago that we remember, that we ground around, that's important. That story is going to become deeply personal. And
so what I hear you saying is the part of the reason that this conversation about story and story arc, and that we've already subtly made this assertion that the scriptures themselves are chocked full of these story arcs in general, and the entire story arc of the scriptures is that it's a narrative arc. That's not at all to say that we're saying it's false, because narrative is not a false or true things. There's true stories and there's made up stories, or what? That's not what we're asserting.
And for almost every part of history, story is how you tell truth.
Totally.
Like there is no there's no way of telling what has been done and what is true outside of story.
Yeah, and so, but what I heard you say there in your summary, like when you're talking about your kids, is the reason this conversation is relevant to us is that we all are living a story.
Yeah.
Every human being that walks the face of the earth is going to run into certain kinds of challenges that they have to then overcome.
Yes.
That's just a story arc.
Yeah.
And so the reason stories resonate with us, and the reason maybe this conversation can connect to you, is to know what should your relationship as an individual be to the challenges of life, and then the tension between that challenge and that hope, that's almost part of what makes life worth living, is the tension between challenge and hope.
Yeah. And this
Because
is
if you lose one or the other,
we
it
need to
falls
hold
apart.
that thought, because that gets into some really interesting places.
Yes.
I 100% agree. When we had, my mom found out she was sick a few years ago, and she's doing really well right now, but she had this like long-term diagnosis thing that she got, and when this was during, I was here at least, I think it was during COVID, maybe it was just before it started.
I remember.
I wasn't here yet. I was still living. It was when I was interviewing, so I was still in New York.
Okay.
But I remember my family got together on Zoom, just my siblings, to talk about it. And the first thing I said is like, oh, man, I don't know. Can we handle this? And my brother said, me and my wife were saying exactly the same thing. Can this family handle bad stuff? Because we've not really experienced a lot of it. Life's mostly been good. And so what happens? So what we need to know as followers of Jesus today is Jesus enough when life gets to the point that they're in now? The king of Babylon's outside the city. Like, so it's easy for me to say yes to Jesus and that Jesus is enough when I'm predicting another 50 years of life with my kids that I love and potentially grandkids and all those different things.
Yeah.
But what if the story doesn't look like that? What if tomorrow there's a stage 4 cancer diagnosis?
Is it gospel if it can't sustain the cancer diagnosis? Yeah. And gospel, by the reason I use that word is it literally means good news.
Yeah.
Is it good news if it isn't big enough to handle the struggle, totally, yes, as well as big enough to I used to have a framework around
messages where I'd say, does it work for a single mother in Haiti trying to survive with her kids post the earthquake?
Yeah.
And that's a challenge. For sure. So I think there is something to this element of storytelling that says, no, God is still God when the story's awful. Now here's where I think it's fascinating based on your point, and this gets us into loads of like questions. This gets very wonderful and weird. Paul suggests at least that faith, hope, and love have some permanence.
Yeah.
And then he also says in another place that who hopes for what they don't have? So what happens to the story when there's no inciting incidents? Does eternity paint a picture of the inciting incidents are done? Or by nature, does God always create new stories?
So that question, it represents one of the greatest crisis of faith I've ever had.
Interesting. That's so fascinating.
So I was literally, I don't know how long ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I was studying narrative arcs and story, and I had this sort of aha moment just about story in isolation, that every single story that's worth telling has to have some sort of crisis, some sort of thing to be overcome or whatever. And that popped in my head. And then seconds later, I said, well, what about eternity? Is there no inciting incident? Because, there's this book by Donald Millard called A Million Miles in a Thousand Years. And in the book, he has this thesis that the same things that make a great story make a great life. That's his thesis that he's exploring. He says, initially he's asking the question, is that true?
Yeah.
Is the same thing that makes a great story make a great life? And then he tries to apply it in that. The book is about that. I highly recommend the book. Anyway, so if that's true, there has to be an inciting incident to make a beautiful life. And then I was like, well, in eternity, if there's no sin, evil, death, destruction, brokenness, is that even a good story? Is eternity a good story? And I had a massive crisis of faith.
Yeah.
And initially, it wasn't a very long one because I had a conclusion that I came to.
Well, and sometimes the get out with those conversations around eternity is simply we don't know very much about it. And what we started with in our conversation was we were talking quantum physics, and there's this experiment from however many years ago, maybe 100 years ago-ish, where they started trying to fire light particles through two slits. And when people were watching, right, it went through one slit versus the other. And when they weren't watching through a detector, it went like a wave. It went everywhere. So bullet when it's watched and wave when it's not. And there's no logical reason why it behaves differently when it's watched. It's like the big version of the whole, like, when a tree falls over in a woods, does it make a sound? And
the question, yeah.
Like there's no answer to it because no one's been there when no one's there.
Yeah, you can't do that.
You can't do that. So it's
well,
like,
this experiment is basically an attempt to
be there when it falls in the woods.
Yeah,
no
but then
around.
if they're there, it does one thing. If they are, and you're like, oh my gosh, and they can measure the outcome.
Yeah, and it was as simple as like if you turn the detector off, it
can be mounted and everything. But if the detector's off, so it's not like the detector. Yeah.
So the truth is, we don't know anything about this world really, let alone an eternal world, and the way that particles work, like. The knowledge that we have of how particles works and how physics works, quantum physics, all these different things, like make the idea of an eternity in a different universe more logical than ever. Even though we don't know anything about it, but like the sense of like modernism of like, oh no, we've started to get beyond all that.
Yeah.
All of this reopens like, no, we're not beyond that at all. We have no idea.
Yeah, this test opened up an avenue of scientific research that was forced to acknowledge how little we know.
Yeah.
Because even the best quantum physicists in the world now have absolutely no explanation. They only have theories. They have no scientific explanation for the observable universe at the quantum level.
Yeah, it's. I mean,
they have no clue.
Yeah, it's just So it's just like so. If you're someone that like for whatever reason has ended up listening to this podcast, that's like, yeah, I'm like kind of like the religious stuff. It's a bit naive. No. The premise of like, no, we know what happens when you die, on a evidential level outside of faith. That's naive. Like we just like there's so much out there that's just mysterious to us. So there's I always feel like when you talk about eternity, there's the small picture we get in scripture.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of faith elements, and my theory around it has always been like if you watch those moments where an animal is born on land that really spends most of its time in the water. You watch these incredible sea turtles, they come up on land to lay their eggs, and these little things scamper down to the water, but they're kind of cumbersome, and then they slip into the water. Penguins, same deal. They kind of waddle around, and you see them in water, and they're sleek and gliding, and I'm like, that's what eternity is. Like it's something that's made for eternity that suddenly ends up in exactly the sort of environment that it's supposed to be. But how can you ever really feel that this side of it? Somewhere there's a delightful.
Well, I think that there's some scriptural hints at what the narrative arc of eternity is.
Okay.
And this gets into a little bit of hypothetical theology, is what I like to call it. But I've got some theories about it, and I won't get into all of them now. But in Genesis, there's several commissionings that God gives to humanity.
Yeah.
He says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Subdue the earth." So care for it and protect it. Sort of hack its chaos back, and be an image of me for creation. Those are sort of the three main mandates that humanity is given. And so even Genesis, this is pre-sin, pre-fall. What's the narrative arc?
It's
not that the Garden of Eden and the Hebrew mindset around the Garden of Eden is not that it was a perfect place. What it was perfect potential.
Yeah.
It was a garden with a bunch of chaos surrounding it that then God and humanity in community would then create, beautify, and cultivate the entire earth or cosmos. And so I think that that's what we do in eternity, is that we are fruitful and multiply. And there's a ton of challenge involved with that. It even in Genesis, pre-fall, no sin has entered the world, and yet there's still chaos. There's undiscovered things. So one of the narrative arcs that I didn't see when I had this crisis of faith initially was not every narrative arc is evil or sin. Some is challenge. So like the story of someone climbing Mount Everest. Mount Everest isn't evil.
Yeah.
The character isn't necessarily evil, but the elements are challenging, and the challenge of overcoming the odds is the narrative arc of a story about that.
And when you
so all of creation and all of the cosmos that God has created can be this place that we have to then find, discover, cultivate, and beautify all of creation and all of the earth.
Yeah.
Or all of the cosmos, maybe. So maybe there's like some multiplanetary discovery. There's some discovery of God's creation. That's tons of challenge. The challenge of creating technology that will allow that possible. And technology that also doesn't damage the cosmos. That's a deeply challenging technological. So there's a ton of narrative arcs.
There's a fascinating illustration of this if you feel like this is getting like beyond you a little bit, and you can go check this out. So the TV show Family Guy does this storyline where they look at Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner.
Okay.
So what's Wile E. Coyote's big, what's his big inciting incident? To try and catch Roadrunner. Like he wants to catch Roadrunner because he wants to eat it.
Yeah.
So what are the possibilities with that story? Well, the one is that he doesn't catch Roadrunner, or he stops, like he just gives up.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah. And then the question is like, what does he do then? Like he can't stop. He's got to keep going. This is his life mission. But then there's another possibility, which is he does catch Roadrunner. And so in all of the cartoons, this never happens. But Family Guy create a moment where he does. And so he catches Roadrunner. Like finally the rock falls at the right time, and instead of falling on him, it falls on Roadrunner and squashes him. And Wile E. Coyote eats him. You see him there eating Roadrunner. He's so happy, like he's always doing all these things. And then it's the day afterwards, and he's kind of like, huh. So you see him like watching daytime TV, drinking a beer, and then someone says to him, what are you going to do now? And he's like, I don't know. I've not really trained for anything else other than catching Roadrunner. So he goes and gets a job in a fast food restaurant, and he's like flipping burgers, and he's just miserable. Like he's so unhappy. So the theory is, why does he never catch Roadrunner in the cartoons? Well, the theory behind it is Wile E. Coyote's actually sabotaging his own mission. So he still has a mission to fulfill. Like he just because when you get to the end of the story and it's over, well, what happens then? Like the Lord of the Rings, same deal. There's this imaginary scenario where what happens with Aragorn, this great king that comes and brings peace, and suddenly everyone to conquer is conquered. And so he sits down and he just gets fat and old, and nothing happens. And this is written into history as well. There's this moment, I'm trying to remember the text it's in now, but there's the language of, and Caesar wept because there were no more kingdoms to conquer. Like the mission is over. Like now there's just the maintenance of it. And so by nature, you look at all of these examples of what happens when there's nothing to do. And so it seems like whatever eternity looks like, however it's pictured, God creates something for people to do. We don't know what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, that work existed pre-fall, pre-sin.
So
work existed.
If your picture of heaven is, that sounds kind of boring. We're just going to sit around singing.
Thanks a lot, Hollywood. You totally screwed up heaven.
Totally. Actually, no. The only picture we're given really is one that like is continually God redeveloping, God living with people, God restoring the mission of Genesis, bringing about new work that's good and fruitful and multiplying. So that just gets fascinating then.
Yeah, and I think that there's enough. Again, the scriptures don't talk about multiplanetary discovery or anything like that, the new heavens and new earth, but if you look at the scope of what we've discovered in the universe so far, and it's like we have hardly any clue. Mm-hmm. Like the first ever photograph of a black hole, we've had mathematical evidence of black holes, but the first ever photograph of a black hole with like 2018
Yeah.
or something crazy like that. And we were like, oh, great. We actually can see it. We've been mathematically being able to see this because of gravitational objects and stuff. But now we have visual evidence that exists. Like, seriously, we know almost nothing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
and we, like, our youth pastor showed us this, like, cosmic, the pillars of creation, which some scientists think that the light from that might, like, this could be completely gone because the light has taken so many years to get to us. Okay, if that's the scope, I think we've got plenty of things to discover and explore with the goodness of God for all of eternity. And I think that's a very compelling narrative arc for humanity to participate and just discover his goodness here and there and there, and then discover something new here and celebrate and rejoice, and then figure out the challenge of trying to discover a new way of approaching this, or how do we cultivate the earth without damaging it? How do we feed the population? Like, these are all beautiful challenges that don't require evil or sin to be.
And so to bring this back to Jeremiah, in this moment of tension and this moment of inciting incident, Jeremiah starts to paint a picture of all will be well. And yet there's still other stories beyond that continue to develop.
Yeah, Jeremiah's not the last book. Yeah.
And so it seems like God knows what stories we need to know about, and what other stories might unfold are completely in his hands. And that's part of this delight for faith. But one of the things that I love about this quantum physics stuff we've been talking about, and just the largeness of it as a field of study, is that if you're someone who's like, no, really intelligent scientific types don't have any sense that there might be a God. Actually, amongst physicists that see the largeness of the universe, there's plenty of examples of people of faith, because they're like, we just can't figure this stuff out. Like, it's beyond us. Yeah. Which is interesting.
Totally. Yeah. Some sort of deity being an explanation for the unexplainable inside of quantum physics is totally a viable, scientifically viable theory.
Yeah.
So super fascinating. I think, so for tying this back to our lives, some of the things that this teaches us about story arc and stuff is that you were designed to carry some load. Every human being was not designed to sit on the couch and veg. That isn't the pinnacle of human existence.
No.
The pinnacle of human existence actually involves solving problems and facing some sort of challenges. Absolutely. So
if you're in a season with young kids, sometimes it's the pinnacle of a night. It's like, this is like
absolutely
as good as it gets right now.
And so, like, I mean, that's actually, but it's kind of encouraging to say, okay, I used to think that when I run into challenges, it was actually some sort of punishment for sin.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And now I can say, not all challenges are like some sort of punishment for sin. Some challenges are actually me fulfilling my purpose as a human being.
And that, like, that element of like story and challenge goes into everything. Like when we've talked about church, teams in church, all those different things, like the doing hard things together, the sense of liminality is crucial to like teams thriving together. If everything's just easy, if there's more staff than you could ever need, if there's more dollars than you could ever need, well, actually it just gets a little bit like, okay, what's the point? Like, why'd you get up in the morning?
Totally.
Like, there's all these different elements to this that come into play. That's just fascinating. The challenges that you experience in life, they're actually good on some level, even when they're hard. And God's commitment to making all things well is constant. So you see that in the cyclicalness of life. Like, there's the harvest, and things are well. And then there's time to plant new seeds for the new story. And then there's the tension of waiting for water and waiting for sunshine and waiting for growth. And then there's like the harvest, and all things are well. And then there's the new season, and there's new planting and new stories to emerge from that season. And that constant change seems like something that is part of God's nature, which is exciting.
Yeah, and wired into how we were made to exist as human beings. So I don't know what season you guys are out there, and we're probably all in different seasons, but some of the pressure that you may be feeling right now might be actually a gift to transform you into something, to help you solve a problem that God wants you to solve in the world. I don't know what it is, but the pressure doesn't necessarily, it's part of the goodness of life. Yeah. Which is even like painful even to say sometimes, because sometimes terrifying. You're like, the pressure I'm facing is I lost a loved one by a terrible means. Okay. But God is immediately, as soon as that evil happens, and it might have been someone evil who took your loved one, or it might have been terribly evil, but God's agenda right off the bat is to, how do I craft this into something beautiful with the person that I love?
Yeah. And how do I listen to God's voice in that? And I'm sure I've used this example on the podcast before, but it's so pertinent that I'll share it again. In Alexander Dumas' Count of Monte Cristo, there's this priest, fatherly figure character that is like, he's the mentor figure. And he in prison, he's been imprisoned wrongly. He's written this incredible piece of literature. And the young character Edmond Dantes reads it and he's like, oh my goodness, this is incredible. How have you achieved all this in prison? What would you have achieved if you'd not been in prison? And the priest is smart enough to say, maybe nothing. Maybe just with all that freedom, all that space, I'd have just wasted my life on frivolities. But something about the concentration that was brought about by this crisis, that was a game changer. So it seems like life can be absurdly painful, and this doesn't mean wishing for super terrible things to happen, but it does mean that somehow God creates goodness or even wellness out of them.
Yeah. So maybe the prayer in those moments of tension should just be like, all right, God, whatever you want to create out of this. Yeah. I think this is insanely difficult, but I want you to create something beautiful out of that. And there's been times, I can tell you, there's been times in my life that that's the only thing I had to cling to. The only hope I had was not, I didn't see a way out. I didn't see it. The only hope I had was, I've seen you produce insane beauty out of this kind of pain, and I want that. Yeah. So do it again.
So I've got a suggestion. What we could do is, we do this at church all the time at South. I'm just going to say a moment of prayer.
I love that.
Because, God, for anyone listening that's going through one of those moments where the story isn't good and doesn't feel like it will ever be good again, God, I pray you would awaken them to possibilities. That doesn't mean that the thing isn't as bad as it gets or as bad as it seems, but it does mean that you constantly create out of those moments. And we're just left in awe of the mystery. So, God, I pray that you'd be close in this season and surprise them with that. Amen.
Amen. Well, thanks for tuning in to the podcast.
Spiritual at the end of the podcast.
Look at that. We're praying on
theology podcast.
I love it. That's so good. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in. We hope you'll tune in next week as we probably talk a little bit about resurrection.
I would hope so,
since we're going to talk about Easter.
And if we see you on Friday, see you on Sunday, we're excited to see you.
Yeah. Love y'all.
See you guys. Bye.
Bye.